Hi everyone. So, we have steadily and slowly moved to the last week of this course, which is the 12th week, and we will be ending the discussions remaining of the content of the course in this week. The major point of discussion this week is the global water diplomacy, where we will talk about the issues related to the transboundary or international water bodies. We will talk about conflicts as well as cooperation in this regard, and towards the end of this week we will try to have a comprehensive summary of the entire course. So, to start with, we will be talking about the transboundary waters, or what we also call as international waters. So, the water bodies or their drainage basins which transact international boundaries. This could be ocean, this could be lakes, this could be river, or even groundwater aquifers and wetlands. So, all such water bodies are typically referred as international water body or international water, or it is also known as transboundary water bodies. So, the river which intersect more than one nation is known as transboundary rivers. So, we have, means all the nations have under their jurisdiction some water bodies, and those which cut across the nations will be called as international waters or transboundary waters, that is fine. But particularly with the ocean, seas and some unoccupied land, there are certain water bodies or certain part of water which is in fact beyond the boundary of any nation. Okay. So, which is outside the jurisdiction of any nation, like nobody owns the entire sea, Atlantic Ocean or the Indian Ocean, nobody owns the entire ocean. There is international norm that from the territory or the land boundary of a nation up to 12 nautical miles distance will be considered as the oceanic territory of that nation, and beyond that 12 nautical miles whatever comes is not under the governance of that particular, or for that matter any nation. So, all such regions where there is which does not fall in the jurisdiction of any specific or any particular nation are referred as high seas. So, high seas are the area which are not under the jurisdiction of any nation and are rather governed by the international norms. Anyway, we will there are 263 transboundary lakes and river basins in the world. So, this total world has a total of 263 transboundary lakes and river basins, and this covers nearly half of the land surface, in the entire land surface. If we see the river basins, the catchment area of these transboundary water sources, so almost half of the earth's land area is covered under this transboundary lakes and river basins. Okay. We do not realize this, but that is the fact. Like for example, if we see, Ganga is not a river only for India, Ganga cut across the Bangladesh as well. So, Ganga is a transboundary river, and you see the kind of basin that Ganga has, it is a huge part. Okay. And it is not only Ganga that we have as a transboundary, Brahmaputra which cut across the China, then there are various other rivers which cut across the Nepal, Bangladesh, Ganga cuts across the Bangladesh, then we have with the Pakistan quite a few rivers cutting across. So, it is not only the condition of India. If you see the collectively world, there are over around half of the earth's land surface falls under the catchment area of these 263 transboundary lakes and river basins. A total of 145 nations that include territories which are in the international basins, this transboundary or international basins if we say. So, there are total of 145 nations which are there, and around 21 countries are there which lie entirely within the international basins. So, they do not have a independent water basin or independent source of water that way. Their entire water comes from these international basins. There are 21 such countries. While most of the basin shared between just 2 countries, there are basins where this number is much higher. Okay. So, there are 13 basins in total worldwide that are shared between 5 and 8 riparian nations. There are 5 basins, Congo, Niger, Nile, Riane and Zamabi, which are shared between 9 and 11 countries. There are rivers that flow, the river which actually flows through the most number of nations is Danube, which travels within the territory of 18 different nations. So, this is the kind of scale our earth or the world is divided between these different international basins. That is primarily because when the division of the nations or countries takes place, the political boundaries that are drawn do not consider river basin boundaries. Okay. They are more to based on the linguistic thing, social cultural aspects, and not primarily on the river basin only. So, out of these 263 rivers crossing international boundaries, only 143 of them have developed any mechanism for cooperation on water management, while 158 lacks any such water management framework. The international water course account for almost 60% of the total runoff and affects roughly 40% of the world's population. So, these are some data which are there to see that how much population of the world or how much number of people relies on these international water basins. Now, why we are specifically pointing out these international water basins or transboundary basins? Because when we say the governance of water where water is within the territory of a nation is easier for that nation to make, but when there are multiple nations involved, the issues are of very different kind. Okay. So, issues can run off can see the interest of that particular nation, where obviously upper riparian state has higher hold onto the water, okay, while the lower one can suffer. There are many such examples. So, in such cases it becomes very important to have a proper mechanism for judicial or equitable allocation of water, particularly in these cases. The issues with states, like the earlier week we were discussing, for example, the Kaveri river dispute, which is between the Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Of course, there were other parties, but major dispute is between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. So, here even if the disagreement arises, there is a central mechanism to resolve it on a state of central government. But in transboundary rivers, because nations are independent and they are not governed under any like in general, these river basins or this thing are not governed as such in any international law, and many nations do not bind to follow international laws. Like in a state and this thing, they are bind to follow the central laws, or they are bind to follow the decisions given from the Supreme Court. However, in cases like this, like in cases where we are talking about the international or transboundary rivers which cut across the nations, there are nations are not as such bind to follow any such regulations. So, when you do not have a supervisory control from anybody, it has become very difficult to manage the things in more equitable and peaceful manner. Now, international waters on this, if we see, there are disparities between riparian countries in economic development, institutional capacity, infrastructure and political orientation, which gives rise to such multilateral or bilateral disputes. Those rivers cutting across multi-nation could have a multilateral multinational dispute as well. As we were discussing, the reason behind such disputes is because the socio-economic status of the different nations could be different. That is the first one. Okay. One, like if you are seeing a dispute between China and say India, there are different strength of China's and different strength of India. Still it is not that big a difference, but if you see a difference between, let us say China with one of the African countries, or say Maldives, or say other small nations, okay, Laos, Maldives and this kind of nations, if you see. So, China holds a much stronger position, being a upper riparian state, holds the sort of can have more control over the water, and being more powerful in socio-economic status over these countries can force them to work accordingly, or even if there are such, let us say, opposition is made in this sense, so China can oppose it and deny following it. So, those kind of things happen when there is differences in the terms of socio-economic development, differences in terms of institutional capacity. So, whosoever has good economic resources can actually fund in the development of the infrastructure, development of the institutional capacity for the management or better hold or capture of the water. Then the political orientations also play a role. Okay, how strong is the political leader? India has seen a lot of this, like if we see the current government regime, which is in the past 4 years as opposed to the earlier government regime. So, there has been lot of differences and lot of disparities in the political leadership as well. Okay, we are now being ruled with a new people, new set of government with new set of thoughts, and earlier it was the different case. So, how strongly a political orientation can put itself in a world forum, okay, that is also very important when we come towards the transboundary water things. There are climate change, deteriorating ecosystem, then the rate of population growth in various nations, different rate of population growth, and the kind, status and the quality of infrastructure, the age of infrastructure that is there. So, these kind of factors are additionally acts towards triggering the issues in these international water sets. Okay. So, the climate change has been one of the most talked about issues in recent past. So, we know that how the climate change is affecting the water sources, and there has been lot of discussion on an international platform to control the climate change and accordingly manage or govern our water resources, looking at the threats coming from the climate change. Then the ecosystem or the pollution part is another reason for the dispute in such transboundary rivers. So, how is the ecosystem, which country is more behaving or acting more responsibly towards the environment, that also makes a lot of inputs to such differences. Then the population growth, rate of the population growth. So, accordingly rate of the population growth, the demand will change, okay. The scale of development, the scale of municipal demand will change, the irrigation demand could change. So, that is also another aspect. So, these are the kind of points which sort of trigger issues related to the international water sets. The cooperation on the shared water resources is crucial, especially in the water stressed and water scarce countries. So, because the countries which are already under water stress or water scarcity, they already do not have the adequate sources of water. Now, if their water, whatsoever the available water relies on these transboundary waters and it is not being cooperated from, let us say, upper riparian states. So, it becomes very difficult for those nations to manage. With already limited resources, if those even if problems are created even with those available resources, so the issue becomes much more complicated over there. The another point is managing the interdependence of these transboundary waters is sort of one of the major challenges in front of the international community, kind of one of the greatest human development challenges, because we have seen that management and development of water relies onto the development of a nation relies onto the largely relies onto the water resources, and since the water resources or major water resources cut across the boundaries of different nations. So, if there is no good cooperation of or the management of these resources or interdependence of the transboundary rivers, because each depends on each other. So, if it is not done, then there could be a problem, and not necessarily that always upper riparian states are in benefit. At times even lower riparian states can create problem for upper riparian states. So, if let us say just across the boundary country decides to make a dam, big dam, and does not allow water to pass through in the downstream in order to regulate the water over there. So, in high flow seasons, the upper riparian countries may get huge degree of flood. So, those kind of flooding can take place in this thing. So, it is better to have a coordinated cooperative approach, have understand and realize this interdependence on each other and come up with a good practice, good plan for managing these international waters or transboundary water bodies. So, if we look on a global scale, so 1/3 population worldwide do not have enough water to meet their daily needs. Further, the demand for water is rising along with the population growth, along with the urbanization, along with the increase in the agricultural consumption, along with the development activities asking more for the industrial waters or water for industrial sector, and obviously when the population is increasing, there is going to be the increased domestic demand as well. So, as per the United Nations, by 2025 nearly 2 billion people will live in the conditions of absolute water scarcity, and almost 2/3 of the world will live in the areas of water stress. We have already discussed that India and China, which constitute significant population of the world, almost around India has around 70%, 17% population of the world, and so is the China, little higher than that at present. So, that means collectively we have around 35 or over 35% of the population. So, just these two nations already has 1/3 of the population residing this, and they are on the verge of getting water stressed. So, by 2025 if India and China are declared water stressed nation, so 1/3 is this one, and then African continent and quite the entire African continent and some sections in the other nations would collectively make it around 2/3 of the world living in the areas of water stress, whereas around 2 billion people are estimated to be under absolute water scarcity. So, that is the sort of one of the major global challenges that we are facing at present. The water and food securities are such issues that it can lead to the violent conflicts, and it has been seen in the past in many parts of the world, okay, because these are the essentials for survival. So, for purpose of survival, one needs, obviously one needs air, one needs water, and one needs food. Now, the air is something which cannot be stopped, okay, and international laws or jurisdiction does not have as such control over the air. Nobody can stop air flowing anywhere, okay. So, since air is naturally available, it is not much part of the concern, only the pollution, some of the pollution aspects are arising with the air, but the availability and this kind of aspect is totally irrelevant for air. The remaining two essential components of the life, which is water and food, are the prime sort of prime reasons for several disputes world over. Moreover, more than the food, because food is something which is may not exactly be provided by the nature, it is something which is produced. So, whatever land area has, a nation can have control over it in order for producing food, and it cannot blame another country for not producing food for one nation. So, even that has little scope for dispute in such a way. The particularly in the international scale, the dispute related to food, there is not much scope, though. The water is the one which is most vital in international cooperation. Why? Because when we see that the water cut across the boundaries of different nations, and there are ways with which people can control it. So, if you and it is a natural resource, it is not being generated by any particular country. So, since it is a natural resource, by law of nature it has to be distributed equitably. Now, if some country tries to stop the water flowing into another nation, so it is going to be basically obviously going to create some sort of dispute and some sort of conflict, and this because it has a direct link with the public. If water is not supplied, it is not the government who will suffer, it is not the managers who will suffer, it is the mainly public who is going to suffer, and that is why the agitation may arise from the consumer level, from the public level, and that can turn violent many times, which has been seen. We discussed in case of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka case last week, that there has been lot of violence, violent activities, particularly in both the states and more so in the Karnataka against the decisions of the or against the management practices suggested award given by the tribunal. So, in case of such system as well, in case of such transboundary waters, if it is not properly or judiciously coordinated, if it is not properly distributed, there are likely to be violent conflict that can arise, because if people will not get water, they will obviously be forced to fight for it, okay, and that can lead to some sort of violent conflicts as well. So, example of such acute cause of water related conflicts includes Iran, Syria and Israeli-Philistine conflicts. These water conflicts are generally considered a major threat to global peace and stability. As we were discussing, because of the nature of such conflicts and because of the dependency of life onto the water conflicts has every chance in fact to turn into the violent, or has turned into a major conflicts if it is not judiciously or amicably resolved in the right frame of time. So, we will conclude this session here, and in subsequent session we will talk about further about some of the reasons for, or some types of the disputes related to the transboundary rivers, as well as we will see how the cooperation can resolve such disputes. Thank you.